I am Gabrielle Hurd, here with the National Park Service in the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, doing an interview with Taylor and Janet Lamborn. Would you guys mind both spelling your names for the record?
I'm Janet Lamborn, Janetlamborn.
Taylorlamborn.
Excellent. And the date is September 8th? Excellent.
Yes.
I got it right. Would you guys mind talking about your family growing up and what stories you guys heard about your family's history in association with the Underground Railroad?
Well, yes. I don't remember when I first heard about the Underground Railroad. It was just part of the meeting in the community where I grew up in southern Lancaster County, where there had been considerable Underground Railroad status. And my great-grandfather, while he didn't keep or consider it as a station, he helped the local major stations when they needed. He knew the territory. When they're literally chasing, they would sick him onto my great-grandfather, and he would lead them astray in the community. So that was his main function. He was also a very influential person in the area, so people turned to him for advice and that.
So when slave catchers would come to town, he would confuse them, like make them go away from where he knew people were hiding?
Yes, get them lost in the banks of the Susquehanna, or take them into a wind cave and get them lost in the cave.
Oh my God.
The wind cave has many sections and so on in. You can get in and take you quite a while to find your way out.
That's amazing. Janet, when did you first hear about these things?
Listening to him. I can't remember the first time I heard the stories, but over the years, he would tell us, the family. We talk about Thanksgiving dinner, always, reminders of that, and also then at meeting, he would also, it would come up over and over again. Whatever the topic was, or not whatever, but several times the topic would be about something, and being able to tell the story was helpful to explain whatever we were talking about. So I heard it over and over and over again.
So you guys would talk about it a lot in sort of like a church setting, and
yes, and family dinners too.
The family was scattered, so we didn't see each other every Sunday. So there's only occasional time during the year you would travel 50 miles or whatever to wherever the family dinner was. So it was a special event, but the family was very proud of their Quakerism and what they had been doing or were doing in current Quakerism, which it wasn't all that, in a sense, not all that different from what the family had done, say, for the Underground Railroad or abolitionists. It was that attitude that the family would be involved. The current activities would be peace activities for nonviolence and programs in Philadelphia. One of the cousins actually was in a position where he wrote a handbook for nonviolence that was used by Barrett Preston and Martin Luther King. So that would be some of the family lore that you would start on family lore, and or start with what they're doing currently and then go back in the family lore.
Well, one of the most often told stories is the love story between my mom and my dad. So they had met at college, and they were dating for a few months, and then finally my dad was able to go to my mother's house to meet the parents, to meet the family, and all of a sudden he realized, oh, look who I already fell in love with, somebody who is also a descendant from the Jackson, the Jackson. So the story is, my mother used to say, is like, I got married because of who my parents, my great-grandparents were, instead of who I am. Of course, that wasn't true because they had fallen in love first, but that was the fun part of the story, was hearing that there was other areas throughout their lives that they intertwined and didn't know it until that day they came home to meet the parents. So that was a fun part of the story.
That's great. That's great. So what particular stories were passed down in your family about assisting freedom seekers? Like, do you guys remember, like, what's one, like, really good detailed story that you know that you'd like to share? If you,
well, probably the one that most impressed me as a small child was hearing these stories from my paternal grandmother, who grew up in Loudoun County, Virginia. She was born in 1861, just in time for the Civil War. So the Quakers I don't even know where Loudoun County is, the northernmost county in Virginia. These train stations, Harper's Ferry. So they as Quakers were already very much abolitionists, and were working for the abolition. Then when the war broke out and the northern troops kept coming through and being geographically located where it was, that was their path. The northern troops' path to the south was right through that territory. And the northern troops, not knowing that they were abolitionist Quakers, they were fair game. Once the troops were south of Potomac, they were fair game. And the southern troops heading north into Gettysburg or York and Columbia and so on, they knew those Quakers were abolitionists, so they were fair game. So I heard stories of how many barns were burnt and how many horses were stolen, how many cows were, and so on. That kept coming back repeatedly. As my grandmother, being a small child at the time, not too young to understand what was going on, but it was obvious to a small child when the elders are under stress and things aren't going right, and barns being burned and so on. So then as she got older to understand it, she would repeat her story on it. So I grew up on those.
I'm not sure I have anything to add to that. It was just, as earlier said, he was very good at telling these stories. At just when it was the four of us, or other larger family meals.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
So, like, you would hear stories a lot of Quakers being persecuted by people from the South on the other side of the border, mostly, you mean? Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. So you said that was your grandmother when she was like a little girl. Do you know how old she might have been when she was?
She was born July 4th, 1861.
Oh my goodness.
1861 and the Civil War.
Oh my goodness. What does she remember about her parents? Did she ever talk about her parents and what they were doing at that time?
Well, I didn't hear so much at that time. Her parents, her father operated a major foundry in the, down the Goose Creek in Loudoun County, had a national business as well as a local business. Because of not understanding certain laws, he was convinced he had to give up part of the national business. And once the war broke out and so on, the Southerners would not deal with that nigger lover, which is a term they used. So he eventually had to give up the business in Loudoun County. The older children had already left for Baltimore and Wilmington, so he took the rest of the family and moved to Wilmington. As he said, that was far enough north that he'd be accepted as a Quaker and abolitionist, but far enough south that they would accept his Southern accent. So he reestablished the family as a foundryman for Baltimore Locomotive. And that's where my grandmother then spent her, might say, her middle years when she was an older person but not yet married. And then she married that farmer from 40 miles away.
So your grandmother's father, he was the man who led people like slave catchers away from people chasing freedom seekers.
In southern Lancaster County, it was my father's grandfather.
Your father's grandfather?
Yes.
Oh.
When I'm talking about Virginia, I'm talking about his mother's grandfather. His mother's grandfather. Well, her father was a foundryman, important businessman, but the next generation back, her grandfather was a very substantial man in the community, and not just the Quaker community, but the community. And once the war broke out, a lot of those relationships were broken, but not all of them by any means. Now, his stature in the community was such that he twice had an audience with Abraham Lincoln during the war, when either the Quakers or the others wanted to have a conversation with Lincoln.
What was his name? Do you know?
Yardley Taylor.
Yardley Taylor.
Yeah, that's where my name comes from. The Taylors there. Yeah, Yardley Taylor. There was a James Janet. There were two of them. There were sort of the people in the community, both the Quaker and the non-Quaker community.
It sounds like on both sides of your family, like were both sides abolitionists and Quakers living in this area at the time. But it was just Yardley Taylor who was working on the Underground Railroad.
He was the big one in. Yeah, Janet has three ancestors arrested under fugitive slave law. And one of them was Yardley Taylor in Virginia. And the other was here in Christiana. James Jackson on my wife's side, and Elijah Lewis on my mother's side. The only part of the family not heavily involved was my mother's father's family. The Pascals was their maiden name. They were not heavily involved the way the rest of the family. Not that they were opposed, they were sympathetic, but they simply didn't get into the positions that most of the rest of the family got into.
Talking about the Christiana rebellion or resistance now, can you guys talk about that? What do you guys know about that in relation to your family? What did you hear stories about the trial growing up or anything?
Absolutely. Yes. Jack couldn't miss it. But yes, the monument downtown here. My mother would frequently, and her father, my grandfather on her side,
Oh, bless you.
actually was in Paoli. To get from Holtwood or Drew Moore to Paoli, there was certain roads my father preferred to take, which kept him out of the town. My mother would insist that he come through the town so she could point out the monument with her great-grandfather's name on it, Elijah Lewis.
That's so cool. So you guys have 3 ancestors, right, who are you're related to from the trial, who are, how does that
All
tie
right.
in?
So James J. Jackson was my mother's ancestor, and then Elijah Lewis was a direct descendant of Dad, and then there's the one was a cousin. I'm not sure. I'm not Scarlett.
Scarlett
Yeah.
and the Lewises intermarried repeatedly in those generations. And nearby here down at Robson Meeting. And Cashner Hanway, the one who was actually put on trial, his wife's maiden name was Lamborn and grew up in the meeting. She was born the year the meeting house and the meeting was formed that I grew up with over in the far side of Lancaster, southern Lancaster County.
So she was born into it and then grew up in it, and then that was the meeting house you went to as well?
Well, yeah, she was born into the Lamborn family who were founding Drew Moore meeting. And then somehow the other, she and Cashner Hanway married. He was more from the Kennett Square area. But somehow they married, and he became a miller here on the outskirts of Christiana. And so during this time, she was his wife there, and having grown up in Drew Moore, it's not actually recorded that she was a member of Bart Meeting. She probably kept her membership in Drew Moore Meeting, but it was involved there. And Cashner was not a Quaker at the time. He obviously was traveling among Quakers and sympathetic. After that period, and his being in prison for 3 months or so, he went bankrupt as a miller. So he had to give up his mill here on the edge of Christiana, and went back to the Kennett Square area, where his wife rather promptly died. She didn't live too long after that. So he remarried her first cousin, whose mother was a Lamborn, and became involved in the Progressive Friends meeting. Now this gets us a whole separate story. What isn't generally many times not understood is that a lot of Quakers were indeed involved, but others deliberately felt that they should not, that it wasn't Quakerly to disobey the law and put yourself out that way. So the Drew Moore meeting, I keep saying yesterday, is the exception. That meeting was 100% behind the Underground Railroad, but most meetings were not. So in the Kennett Square area, which was a very heavy Quaker area, in fact, one author says there were undoubtedly Quaker women who spent their entire lives and never saw a non-Quaker. In other words, there's a lot of Quakers in the area. So, and not all of them were gung-ho supporters of abolition. So they formed a separate meeting, which is now at the entrance to Longwood Garden, if anybody have seen that. And Cashner Hanway was one of the founders of that meeting. So that shows his progression as to how he looked at it. He was not an educated person. So after the trial, Castner Hanway and Elijah Lewis were in demand to travel and speak to abolitionists rooms. So I grew up hearing those tales. Lucretia Mott, because being a very important person in history, and so on. And some people had said, well, Elijah, Castner Hanway was the one on trial. It wasn't he the one everybody wanted to see. Well, that may have been true, but Elijah Lewis had the education that he could talk. So they made a team.
That's great. That's great. So this was when they were at the meeting house there. How did the meeting house in that area react? Do you know, like when the trial began, or what was the feeling after the resistance? Do you have any stories from that time about like what happened to the town or the meeting house? Like, was there any conflict there?
The meeting is BART meeting, which
BART
were all
meeting.
4 of them were connected. And from what I've been, should I be talking into this thing?
Yeah, if you can. You don't have to put it real close, but it definitely helps.
My understanding is that Bart was very sympathetic, and if you go out the valley, in fact, we went out the valley yesterday, past some of the big farms, which were Underground Railroad stations. Not only were they, might say, big farms and prominent, but they were the substantial people in the meeting.
So people in like pretty big farmers in the area were members of BART meeting.
Yes.
So there was some like pull that could help in the meeting house to maybe like help them in the trial or help their families.
Not so much in the trial, but yes, help the family. Castner Hanway was the one that needed the most help. There's not stories on that directly. My understanding is that the meeting was supportive of the whole action and so on. But I do not have direct stories, partly because Castner Hanway moved away so quickly.
He moved away after...
To the Kennett Square area and progressive area.
Let's see. So do you remember like a specific instance of when you were told these things? Like what family member in particular would like tell you these stories?
Well, in the Bart area, that's my mother's family, and that was a rather strong family, with ancestors going, in fact, on both sides, but that side in particular, they traced their ancestors back here to Berks County, and direct descendants of the Boones and the Lincolns. So that was part of the story, that they're descended from those. But the people involved were abolitionists for that side, the Lewis side of the family. Another part of the story was, however, that the Boones, in Extra meeting, which is another meeting nearby here, they were slaveholders. So that put another flavor in how the family looked at it. And in fact, part of that family became non-Quaker and became judges here in Berks County, and pretty much told the non-Quakers that he no longer wanted to deal with there was Quaker country hicks. That wasn't one of the popular stories, but it was one of the significant ones.
So part of the family's been here for a long time, and part of the family are the Boones, and they went on to become slaveholders and slavers.
Yeah, the Boones and the Lincolns and the Lees came to Exeter meeting around 1717 to 1730. I'm not sure exactly which one came exactly which year, but yes, they came very early. And the Boones in particular kept their slaves.
Where did they live? And what?
If you go out of Reading on 422 toward Philadelphia, Birdsboro, if you look at a map, Birdsboro, you're only about 15 miles at the most out of Reading to or maybe it's 12 miles to Exeter meeting, a very old Quaker meeting. And that was settled by the Boones and Lincoln, and not the Lincolns. The Lincolns were not Quaker. That's a whole other story. But the Boones and the Lincolns and the Lees, I'm descended from those multiple times. And
Daniel Boone Homestead is the area he's referring to. The Exeter meeting is near Daniel Boone Homestead. So most people are familiar with Daniel Boone, and but I think if my understanding, Daniel Boone's parents were Quaker, but not Daniel Boone. So the Boones got away from Quakerism.
Well, for a couple of reasons, they actually moved from Berks County down the Shenandoah Valley to North Carolina. And Daniel was 16 when they left here, and he never joined the Quakers per se. The family did. They actually established Quaker meetings down there. That's a whole separate story that preceded the abolitionist era.
So that came before. This is like another layer to the story before the abolitionism began. Was this still in Pennsylvania, like before slavery was outlawed in Pennsylvania?
Well, the Exeter area here in Berks County, yes, Pennsylvania, but they moved down the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, settled there first, established Quaker meetings.
So they moved to Virginia. They settled in Virginia first, and then came up to Pennsylvania.
For about a generation, and then moved to North Carolina, and then went over the mountain to Kentucky, which is where Abraham Lincoln was born. And some historians have criticized Abraham Lincoln for making reference to his abolitionist history and Quaker history and so on. Abraham Lincoln's correct. Even though some of the historians say that the Lincolns weren't Quaker. So that's a background that Lincoln had that most people don't understand or don't recognize.
So there was multiple parts to the Lincolns and the Boones,
absolutely.
Yeah. When did so they were really state hopping. They got everywhere. Let's see. So when do you guys when you guys talk about these stories, do you just talk about it within the family, or do you talk about it with the public at all? What's your relationship with this story in your lives?
I usually hear the stories when he's talking to other people, depending on what the situation is. It seems to come up, and so I've never heard the story all the way through from beginning to end, or vice versa. So I would hear bits and pieces depending on how the topic came up. I would hear a portion of the story, and then I would hear. So he never sat down with me and just said, "This is the story." also because it came up in conversation, either with other family members or with other people of our meeting, or just in general. Somebody would ask a question, and next thing I know, a story is popping out, and and
Well, if we have time today, maybe we can try to tell it from, that's the chronological order.
I don't, because I only hear bits and pieces of it. And my memory isn't as good as his, so he can recall details in great detail, and I can only remember, the summary or the Cliff Notes version of it. But I would hear of different aspects of the story over the years, and so it's when I hear it over and over again that I'm starting to put the pieces, all together.
If you guys were to tell the story of, let's say, like the Christiana Resistance, where would you start with the story from your relative's perspective? And then maybe we can try to like build that narrative today if you're...
I don't know. The Christiana part of it, it sort of just happened that our relatives were involved. I mean, they were prone to be able to put themselves in place to be a resistance, to say no, don't take that guy, don't do that. They didn't just wake up that morning and say, "Today's the day I'm gonna do something for the Underground Railroad." It's just over the years of their lives, and the support of the community. And a lot of times, the support of the community was, because they were active, and some of us just they agreed with the thinking, and could be supportive that way. And the same with we don't have any stories of how Bart Meeting supported the families while the three men were in jail, or the black people from the community. We don't have any stories of that, but I'm sure, because they were always supportive, and whether it's holding people in the light or saying prayers, or whether it was physical help, that's always happened anyway. So we don't have any specific stories to answer your earlier question.
Okay, that's okay.
Yeah. And the same with being at the right place at the right time. A lot of it was coincidence, based on just being able to. I mean, that's where their interest was. People knew that they were interested in it. So when the word came out that the marshal was coming, like it was a natural instinct. It was not like a.
It wasn't something.
As far as like the way I understood it, it was just a natural instinct rather than. Today I was put my foot down and let myself get arrested.
It was what they did.
Yeah.
James Jackson had a very high stature in the community, not just among the Quakers, but in the community otherwise. In fact, he was sort of the banker of the community before there were banks. And then leading up to this, James Jackson, his brother-in-law, and Lindley Coates of Salisbury Meeting were very strong abolitionists, and wrote and brought people together as abolitionists.
So were they leaders in the community, like encouraging abolition?
Yes. In fact, Lindley Coates was somewhat older than these others. He was definitely the leader, but he established the what's the name, abolitionist movement in Philadelphia, and got it up to 250 members when he turned it over to what's the famous abolitionist? It's in the books.
Frederick Douglass, maybe.
Frederick Douglass was involved. But this was a white man that brought that's the one of the most famous abolitionists. Took it over from Lindley Coates here in Salisbury Meeting.
Oh, gosh. I'm just saying names. John Brown?
John Brown wasn't an abolitionist. So, now, the Loses, as a family, well, not just in this area, not just in Christiana, but Elijah Lewis grew up about 6 miles from here in a Quaker meeting, another Quaker meeting here in Berks County. In fact, I think you used to get some pictures of that neighborhood. He and Joseph Scarlett. Joseph Scarlett's family in that area went back generations. And then Joseph Scarlett, the fourth, married a girl from Christiana and came up here and started Underground Railroad here. But these were long established families in the communities, as leaders in the communities for whatever. Mm-hmm. The Loses in particular were leaders in a broad area. Elijah Lewis's father, brother, Enoch Lewis, was the surveyor of the city of Philadelphia. He was a mathematician and was the surveyor. He had the math to do it. He established the mathematics department at Westtown School. Any of you familiar with Westtown School? Historically, it's the preeminent Quaker boarding school, located in Westtown, which is a suburb of Westchester. Nowadays, you could say that. And he established other Quaker schools. His son, Joseph Jackson Lewis, is credited with making it possible for Abraham Lincoln to become president. He worked, Abraham Lincoln being out of the Midwest, needed somebody here in the East. And this Lewis was that person. As a reward, he was made Commissioner of Internal Revenue when Lincoln established the income tax. They did away with it and brought it back in 13, and what we are using now as the basis of the income tax was written by Joseph Jackson Scarlett Lewis here. So that was the stature that Elijah Lewis family and were growing up and communicating with. Elijah Lewis spent his did not spend his career in academia, but everybody around him did. So that's part of the family background and why things, what they were doing to the family was what you do. It may sound unusual for most people looking at it, but that's what the family did, the Lewis family.
So they were pretty highly educated
for the time,
and they had like a pretty high. They were living in Christiana, that you said, like where their families were.
They were out of the Welsh tract. They were Welsh. The Welsh tract is Haverford, Ballackenwood, and some of the other names down near Philadelphia that we English speakers have trouble with, and then they spread out around Philadelphia and so on. And at that time, a highly educated person had a high school education out of Westtown School. That was the place to get your education, was the Westtown boarding school or day school. So while most of them didn't get college degrees, many of them did. And there were some doctors in there, including a female doctor of some note. Back when women didn't become doctors, she was a female doctor of note. So that's the sort of the climate that Elijah Lewis grew up in. Mm-hmm. And that simply carried down through the generations. That's what you did. Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Do you guys have any questions?
I do. I have a couple of questions. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing all of this too. I feel like I'm wrapped. I'm thinking, in listening to you speak, I'm thinking back to the 1850s, and you mentioned that that abolitionist thinking is kind of butting heads with, there's still some slave owners in the nearby vicinity, and there are also then some Quakers and folks in the community who want to follow the rules and not break the law. And I'm really thinking about like what that means in a day-to-day climate. And I'm wondering if you can talk about how your family kind of navigated that.
In 1828, there was the major split in Quakerism, the Hicksite Orthodox split. The Orthodox pretty much wanted to keep things the way they were. No music or instruments, no art. They really resisted that. They resisted the abolitionist movement for the reasons that you stated. The Hicksites, for the most part, sort of followed along similarly, but a lot of the Hicksites would kick over the traces and become strong abolitionists. The meeting I grew up with, Drew Moore, was purely Hicksite. My grandfather used to point out that there were no Orthodox ever in Drew Moore meeting. He was proud of that because the Hicksites did this abolition and so on, and they played the violin. My son is the seventh generation of the Lamborn men to play the violin. Back when Quakers didn't play the violin, my ancestors played the violin, as did the Boones. George Boone brought his violin to this country. And every generation after, there was at least some Boones playing the violin, including my son. Now I played the violin, but it was evident that if I did something else, I'd be spending my time more profitably. But I did play the violin as a student. And same way with, at Drew Moore meeting, one of the families there, the mother was a Lamborn. They formed a quartet of string and wind instruments and played the neighborhood. Back when Quakers still weren't playing the instruments. So that's sort of the Hicksites, a lot of them would do that. And that's where a lot of this abolitionists came out of, that attitude. Right here in Berks County, at Robson meeting, a few miles from here, that meeting went Orthodox. But about, I don't know how many people, half a dozen or a dozen, were abolitionists and had Underground Railroad stations here in Berks County. And the meeting did not actually kick them out and allowed them to be buried in their burial ground. So that's sort of the flavor of the time. The Orthodox wouldn't have to do anything overtly for the abolition movement or Underground Railroad. But when those rebellious Scarlets and Panels did their thing, they were still allowed to be present, and they're, you can go down now and look at a couple of the gravestones. They're still there. So there's this sort of dual feeling that was quite prominent during that era. My great-grandfather Lewis, as Elijah Lewis's son, went into the Civil War. Orthodox Quakers have a strong peace testimony and pacifist tradition, and you did not go into the army and so on. But a number of Hicksites did. So there's that. And so that's something you, talking about it in the family, that can get families to going. That back and forth. One thing that the Lamborns have been doing, you're talking, getting on record and so on. Starting about 3 years ago, my first cousin's older daughter, with a degree in museum science, decided that her father's letters that he wrote back home from doing his alternative service, that is, he was a pacifist, and back when you had to go into the army or something, he had his MD degree, so he served as a pacifist doctor in Central America and sent back extensive letters. So starting with that, it's still going on. The second Monday, hopefully the second Monday of every other month, we have Zoom meeting from Vermont to California and every place in between, of family members talking about what we're doing. And it gets into not just that we bought a new Toyota. It's much more serious than that we're talking about. And I'm looking ahead. Hopefully, she will be able to pull that together. That's what her intention is. That there's going to be record of these things, and some of the things that the family's done are, as I've said already, I consider significant, and it's what has been done over the years, and she's trying to get it down onto as a record.
And so when you say more serious things, you mean thinking about the values of like peacekeeping and pacifism, and that have those roots through abolition to early.
Yes. And of course now the big topic is climate change. So there's a tradition there that I see and others in the family see. So the 1850s and so on, what our ancestors did then, that's we like to pat ourselves on the back enough to think that we're continuing that tradition, and some of them definitely are.
If you could speak to your ancestors at that time, what would you want to tell them or talk to them about now?
Good. I suppose you could say that some of your difficulties were beneficial.
Any questions?
I just wanted to take everyone back to like talking about like when you were born and where you were born. and how does that kind of impact, the involvement of your family with the histories? Just trying to know, when were you born and where?
Well, excuse me. My brother and I were generation number 7 on the Lamborn homestead. It was obvious that my brother would be the one to take over the farm, so I went off and got a sheepskin that says chemist. So yes, we had, and the coming up through the various lineages, farming was always a direct part of it. But in each generation, there was just the lineage of the farmers, but there were brothers and sisters who did not take over the farm and were not part of the farm. They became engineers and like the part of the railroad switch. It was invented by a Lamborn brother back many generations ago. A lot of things like that. Another side on the Elijah Lewis family. Pyrex was put into production by a cousin, and just a lot of things like that. That's tradition. You could call it tradition, but it's what occurred each generation. My brother became the farmer. I went off. You can't live in today's world without using something that I had something in the development of it. So, and that's the way it is.
Plastics.
For me, it's industrial plastics, yes.
Yeah, I think another thing I wanted to mention is that you have a great recollection about, some of those wonderful stories which you've shared with us today. Are there any initiative to kind of share all of the stories and histories with, people within the community, or are you thinking of ways to kind of share and, document some of these histories? I know this is like a step in the right direction, but are there other existing, initiatives to share the stories with the community?
Well, what my cousin's doing on the second Mondays, hopefully there's going to be things there. That's her objective. A museum scientist, that's what you do. You keep things and so on.
Participating in tomorrow's event at Christiana. And Christiana is a big way of telling these stories. So most of the people who come to the Christiana Historical Society Day, or what's the name of it? Anyway, Christiana Historical Society Day, they're just interested in the surface level of understanding understanding the Christiana riot and lead up to the Civil War. But there's some people who really get interested in hearing these stories that Dad has to tell. So it's enjoyable to watch and tell these stories to the people who come to these events. And I like going to the Christiana too. I like going to the Christiana Historical Society event on tomorrow. I'm looking forward to it. And speaking to children, coming in, and it's all new information for them. So it's kind of see their face light up, and then point to the picture of Lewis and the picture of Jackson and say, I'm related to them. So that's kind of nice. And then the log that Elijah Lewis kept when he was in prison, I enjoy showing that off. So look at all these famous abolitionists that came to visit my ancestor.
When you guys tell these stories, what impact do you see that it makes on people? Especially children when you're telling them and they don't really know maybe what abolition is before you talk
Yeah.
about it with them? Do you see, how do you see that affect them?
Well, I see that people, they might have heard just a little bit in school, so to hear a little bit more, and it's more interesting to learn it that way within just the classroom experience. So it seems you end up with questions, surprising questions. And I can't think of, I won't be able to think of an example right now, but and they want to know what people wore. So, and they want to know the difference between what Quakers are like in modern day world and what they were like in the 1850s and 1860s. You know, a lot of people vision Quakers. They think Quakers dress the way they did in 1860. I'm like, no. So sometimes explaining some of these stories talks about that. Also, it also in terms of thinking about how people get active in the community. You know, looking at my ancestors is a good example of being active in the community, and kind of I grew up with the idea that you're supposed to become active in your community. You don't just let other people do things. Dad mentioned earlier climate change, and I went to a PNC bank and sat down on the floor with a group of other people and closed that bank down as a protest against what PNC Bank was doing, financing the mountaintop coal removal. And I was working with Equate, and we succeeded. PNC no longer invests in that. So that's one of, I did that because protecting the environment is important to me, but I had the example of people in my family standing up for these things. So it's a joy to be able to share these experiences my family did, and share the experiences that my family is currently doing. So,
What do you think, growing up and hearing these stories about, your family's activism in the community, like I'd love to hear more about your activism in addition to, what you guys did to stop PNC Bank from, I think that's really interesting.
Yeah. Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, do you do any other activism in addition to that? Like, is there with the climate, protesting climate change?
Yes, I've been on a Peace and Social Order Committee through my meeting, and I've been on that committee for, I don't know, I can't remember how long, forever. And I've served as clerk of that committee for several years. It's not quite as active in the last couple of years, but we've done letter writing campaigns to the United States representatives and Pennsylvania representatives for various. There's a long list of interests. And I serve my meeting now as clerk, so I do a lot of volunteer that way. The most exciting thing was the PNC thing. But I've also gone to Washington, D.C. and other places for the pipeline demonstrations. I haven't been out to South Dakota physically, but I've been very supportive of those at the pipeline demonstrations out there on the Sioux Indian area.
That's really great. Thank you.
Sometimes I draw a blank on this one. I need a term. That's one I can't think of it.
You're telling me. I relate.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for everything you guys told us about today. It's all been really inspiring. Can you, wrapping up, do you guys have any like specific places in your mind related to these events that you can think of as that should be marked as historical markers or historical landmarks?
Oh, that's a tough one because a lot of the places don't exist anymore. I'm more about maybe seeing more information in museums more so than the physical locations around Christiana. If a museum is talking about the Civil War, why not have a spot for this the Christiana resistance? Because so often it's glossed over, or that's get people remember Harper's Ferry, but they don't remember Christiana. So it'd be kind of nice to see it in that way, or these days people are all about finding things on the internet, so maybe having a larger presence on the internet. The Christiana Historical Society could do a bigger presence, for example, or others, or the national park could have bigger, more internet presence. So when people are searching with their interest, so people on their own can, when they're ready to learn more, can find more rather than forcing them to memorize something in school.
Yeah. Well, oh yeah. What is?
Two organizations that I like to support, and I think can be very significant. One is the French Committee on National Legislation. You probably have heard of that. I like the way their whole attitude is of course, to look at legislative issues from, I don't want to say the Christian viewpoint, because that's too narrow, but from the attitude of doing better in the world with whatever you're doing, and also I've over the years I've been a member and sometimes participant in the Union of Concerned Scientists, which is really similar to the French Committee on National Legislation, but specifically on scientific issues.
That's really great. Well, before we take up too much of your time, is there anything else you guys want to add on to the record before we close for today?
Well, when it comes to race relations, one of my earliest memories was one Sunday going to visit Grandfather Pascal down at Paoli, and my father preferred to stay out of Christiana and cut across on Gap Road and go past the Williams place, which was a big farm. My grandfather, my mother's father, never owned a farm. He always farmed a farm or became a manager of big farms. But when my mother was 3 or 4 years old, for the next 5 or 6 years, she lived on the Williams place, which it was a big farmhouse, and then up the road a little bit, a little house very much smaller where the hired man lived. Definitely not where the farm master lived when it came to the building. During the time that my mother's father was farm, the hired man, which came with the farm, was a black man with children of the same age as my mother's siblings, she and her siblings. And she made the point that she and her man's children played with each other in each other's houses. It didn't make, to them, they didn't care which house they're in. One time they go to one house and the other time the other house. But my mother said the criticism that her mother received from the neighbors for allowing her children to play with those children, that was a lesson to me when it comes to race, very early race relation lesson. And it of course, it was a very important one. For me, it was very significant.
For me, one of the things I think about is that although there was 34 black people arrested during the Christiana Resistance, only 4 white people were. And I have to wonder, it was brave for those 4, but I would wish there was more of the white community involved. So it's, I was taught to, and I still am, very proud of the 4 people that directly or indirectly related to stepped up. And so, but where was the rest of the community is the question. And you could tie that to today. So a lot of, I've done some activism, at least a little bit, and there's a lot of people I know surrounding me does activism, but then there's a lot of people who don't. So I want to know, if it's important to you, where are you? What are you doing? Even writing letters is better than just letting things slide. Mm-hmm. So I think that's why my message is step up. Whatever is important to you, step up for it and do something.
That's an amazing last word for today. Thank you so much, you guys, for speaking with us today. And that'll be it for the interview. Thank you.
Thank you.